Thank you very much. Andrea, where are you? Oh, yeah. Thank you very much for your talk, Andrea. And we move on to Soyun Park. Yeah, my good friend and fellow Spinozist here at the Institute of Philosophy. She is also a PhD student working under the supervision of Professor Roland Breuer. Her current research focuses on the conceptual intersections between 17th century metaphysics and ethics, specifically Spinoza and Malebranche, and 18th century political economy. Her presentation today is titled Feigning and Double Negation, Spinoza's Approach to Negative Reasoning.
Good morning. Today I'm going to discuss a very, very preliminary sketch of a paper that will discuss two forms of negative reasoning in Spinoza's philosophy. As it is still in the early stage, I would really appreciate the comments and thoughts and, on its content and also a research design, etc. So, in a good Spinozist manner, maybe we begin with the appropriate definitions. By negative reasoning, I simply mean a reasoning or series of inferences that begin from a negative premise. One form of negative reasoning will be good, and the other will be evil, according to Proposition 27 of Book 4 that states, we know nothing to be certainly good or evil, except what really leads to understanding or what can prevent us from understanding. The good negative reasoning takes the form of reductio ad absurdum, and the evil negative reasoning takes the form of reductio ad ignoratiam. And at the crux of the matter is the concept of feigning. I hypothesize that the good form of negative reasoning is feigning as an intellectual activity, as discussed and featured in Tractatus de Intellectus Emendatione. The bad form is, not surprisingly, a scholastic one. In this talk specifically, I'm going to discuss Francisco Suarez's manner of dealing with this in the volume 2 and 31 of his Disputatione Metaphysicae. While Spinoza's critique of schoolmen, I think, can fit more or less to many thinkers like Duns Scotus, Avicenna, and so on. But I think because of how much Spinoza is sympathetic to some of the aspects in Suarez's philosophy, it has to be Suarez's philosophy that has to be rebuked first. So his discussion of feigning initiates his review of suspect ideas that have to be removed from our minds. But his description of feigning is rather peculiar. It's not just faking or pretending in the way we usually talk about it. Putting aside his critical depiction of fiction as presented in the Ethics, in the TIE, feigning in fiction here, to me, reads still a bit innocent. For instance, Spinoza here allows for an accidentally true fiction. So, his approach to the analysis of feigning is, when read really carefully, really interesting because he makes a formal and objective distinction of feigning, or in plain words, the act of feigning and the act of feigning is distinguished from the resulting fiction, or the thing that is feigned in this act. Additionally, he immediately indicates his object of critique. He says, as it is often the case, that feigning results from a perception that regards a thing as existing or regards only its essence. He will also follow this division, and whose perception, the Scholastics. And the problematic way they approach the being, either as esse essentiae or from esse existentiae, supposed as either as two really separable things by negative abstraction, or at least precisely abstractable from one another. To explain these two terms briefly, the negative abstraction is for the things really separable from one another, and however particular thinker understands this separability. It could either be physical or metaphysical things like rationality, animality, and so on. As for the precisive abstraction, for our purpose, it is enough that we understand that precisive abstraction as a separation from an intellectual consideration that need not reflect the reality as it is. So even if a thing's parts or aspects are never actually separable, for the good, or for Spinoza bad, of our understanding, we can cut things up and attend only a certain parts that are of our investigative interest. And these are two modes by which scholastics had separated the essay. And obviously their main problem will be stitching it back together. Now, as I said, the first half of my talk will be on the good negative reasoning, which will follow Spinoza's formal and objective approach. So I ask, who can feign? What is the act of feigning? And then I will explain the objective side, the fiction itself, so the formal aspect. As Spinoza points out in his discussion about the separated and thus possible existence, the activity of feigning requires a constitutive ignorance about the unknown external cause. Once we know about the external cause in question, we cannot genuinely feign anymore. That is, it is the ignorance that sustains this mental activity. On the other hand, I know I exist, so I cannot feign my own existence or non-existence. If it is the case that I'm conscious of my error in the false fiction, even if I state the same fiction out loud, this is just a mere utterance, or I'm just allowing this feigning for other ignorant people. Alternatively, I have lost the past awareness of this error, and I come back to the same position of ignorance and can feign things again. If so, feigning is an intellectual activity, intellectual capacity unique to the finite mind. And therefore, I quote, God or something omniscient, he can feign nothing at all, end of quote. It is notable that Spinoza allows for what seems like a structurally redundant or at least a bit awkward expression, like a fictitious thing which is false by its very nature or true by its nature, because in the TIE, the fictitious idea only means an idea whose proximate cause, this or that finite mind, formally involves the lack or the ignorance. So if this is how feigning is conceived, it is no more than some kind of an intellection or thinking under condition of ignorance. This mind is not yet right or wrong because it did not assent yet. And this ambiguous state, however, is exactly our situation after we've read a new proposition presented in the Ethics. As we read through the proposition's demonstration, we reason along with Spinoza, following the self-evident inferences from already established propositions, definitions, and axioms, until we reach the final letters QED. Now we know the proposition, so we cannot feign anymore. And if this reasoning under the condition of ignorance begins with a negative premise, it becomes a deductive process that produces a double negation in the form of reductio ad absurdum. It becomes a deductive investigation into a false premise, which necessarily culminates in this premise's terminal negation. This good reductio is used the most in the first book of Ethics. I think, many of us probably have read the first book and thought, why is he writing this proof like this? It's so long and ugly. And I think Spinoza knows what he's doing. I think he is training our reasoning. Our natural condition is the one in which we often find ourselves reasoning from a false premise than a true one. The maxim, ex falso secutor quod libet, is so for Spinoza wrong. As Spinoza claims, When the mind attends to a fictitious thing, which is false by its very nature, so that it considers it carefully and understands it and deduces it from it in good order, the things that have to be deduced, it will easily bring its falsity to light. And just as we need not concern ourselves with the initial negative premise or the final absurdity after the demonstration is over, perhaps we need not concern ourselves with our particular cases of sad knowledge. Maybe the accumulation of the sad knowledge do not amount to anything. The point is not to learn the lessons, but know how to reason yourself out of a state of ignorance or of the imposed falsehood, and to reach the point of termination for this train of thought, to learn how to get out of a rut. Now we can see how it is indeed the intellection that limits the fiction. After the repeated practices of reductio ad absurdum in the book 1, under the guidance of Spinoza, by the time we get to the passion therapy, our minds are really prepared for it. And by the time we get to book 5, we no longer reason like a finite mode, but we're mostly demonstrating propositions in what could be called a divine mode of proof, one that unfolds exclusively through affirmative deduction, infinitely generating real things eternally from God's true and simple definition, successfully and without any interruption. Perhaps through feigning and this good negative reasoning I propose, we can understand one way imagination is in collaboration and supports understanding beyond a sign or figure that might aid our geometric reasoning. Now, onto the objective aspect of feigning. The produced fiction, I quote, never makes or presents to the mind anything new, but that only things which are in the brain or in the imagination are recalled to memory, and that the mind attends confusedly to all of them at once. Speech and a tree, for example, is recalled to memory. Since the mind attends confusedly without distinction, it allows that the tree speaks. Existence, when it is conceived so generally as being, then is easily applied to all things which occur in the mind together. But more importantly, we have to consider feigning that begins from an affirmation of contradiction, in which case nothing at all is feigned. There is no fiction, but true and sheer assertions. I think this is Spinoza's reformulation of ex contradictione sequitur quod libet. What interests us is that one of his description for the affirmation of contradiction is a impossible supposition of a candle burning in some imaginary space or where there are no bodies. He writes, quote, "Nothing is done except to abstract the thoughts from the surrounding bodies so that the mind directs itself toward the sole contemplation of the candle, considered in itself alone, so that afterwards it infers that the candle has no cause for its destruction, remain immutable. It is a candle by negative abstraction, removed from anything that can be considered separable from it. By this separation, its relation with external thing in nature are removed, and thus Spinoza's essential differences too. By the Spinoza's essential difference, I mean the one discussed in paragraph 55, where he states, quote, "The same difference that exists between the essence of one thing and the essence of another also exists between the actuality or existence of one thing and the actuality or existence of the other. But the point is that the candle in question is removed from the common order of the nature and is made into a non-being." So now we can go into the reductio ad ignoratiam. This is the context in which we find the second evil form of negative reasoning. Remember that at this point, we are no longer feigning, but making whatever assertions we please from the initial contradiction. If infinite real things follow God's from God's generative definition, a vacuous infinity of non-beings follow from contradiction. The problem is that with the negative abstraction and its separation of the connected things, is that first, in terms of metaphysical negative abstraction, a genus is always separated from and lacks the differences that consist the species of this genus. Then, strangely enough, a subcategory has what its supercategory lacks. Second, in terms of physical negative abstraction, from which we might cut up a composite substance into partial substances like form, matter, and then accidents and modes, here the problem is that because Suarez is also working with the immanent reality, where all the really separate things have their own singular essences, actual essences that are identical to actual existence, we come to an odd situation in which the perfection of partial causes are less than the perfection of the produced whole. But the first critique is not so critical for a nominalist like Suarez. And as for the second case, he just bites the bullet and say, okay, I will accept that only the efficient cause and final causes need as much or more perfection than their effects. It's not the case with formal or material cause. So the Spinoza's critique must rebuke a much more important point, which I think is on the point of precisive abstraction of being. Now, as just mentioned, the actual essence and the actual existence can be separable only by a mental or precisive abstraction. There are two metaphysical issues that must be noted. The first concerns the being in general, and the second concerns the finite being. As for the finite being, Suarez justifies his precisive abstraction between its essence and existence, driven by interest to find essence intrinsically denominated within, outside of its own efficient cause. Basically, because a finite thing is not a necessary being like God, whose essence involves existence, the finite being's essence should be precisely abstractable from its efficient cause. That's what he's trying to get at. Why should its definition involve the proximate cause when we're interested in finding, quote, something that would be considered as altogether intrinsic and necessary, and so to speak, the primary constitutive of that thing, without which it cannot be conceived of. The predicates which are taken from it are said to belong to it with absolute necessity and essentially, because without them it can neither be nor be conceived of. Although in reality they do not always belong, but they do when a thing exists. But what he saves here is not the essentia actualis anymore that we've started with, but essentia idealis, which are, quote, not fictitious or chimerical, but one that is true and suited to actual existence, end of quote. In fact, what we've found here, the real essence, is the objective concept of being, which was again precisely abstracted from its formal concepts. And two concepts are common to all actually existing entities as they agree in actual being and entity. Suarez identifies the act of being, actus essendi, as a formal concept, as a participle, which initially confers the essence, essentia, but is mentally separated proportionally. So he's trying to save the doctrine of analogia, essentially. Here we have the objective concept of being as a noun by which we recognize things to be. To put it bluntly, it's the difference of some and ens. Apparently, what justifies this move from actual being as conceived in the formal concept to the objective concept as the real essence, abstracted from actuality, is by a method he calls transference of signification. The beingness is transferred from one concept to another, and his explanation, disappointingly, is really no more than a reliance on the custom about the words, how people speak. And he's usually a master in argument making, and I was rather surprised that this is what he ended with. It is at this point that Suarez insists explicitly that this precisive abstraction does not add negation, namely that of lacking actual existence, which is a negation or privation that being in potency adds. Suarez, I think, is aware of the point of vulnerability in his thesis, and he has to retain the connection between actual existence and real essence, which is apparently saved by the transference of signification. Now let us return to Spinoza's text. I think this transference of signification is what is referred as the metaphorical transference to mute things in Spinoza's writing, in Descartes' Principle of Philosophy. In TDIE, Spinoza warns against the use of words, which is part of imagination in our memory. He also complains about philosophers that use grammars and language. And finally, in the Ethics, I think it is fully fleshed out from the book 2, Proposition 18, and on as the order of concatenation of the affection of human body. It is first by this metaphorical transference of signification, undergirded by the joining and concatenating images of things, that a mind engaged in the evil negative reasoning is prevented from seeing its non-productivity. In the ease of perverse and vacuous infinite inferences, the finite mind is tricked by its own commotion. It can continuously succeed without interruption to make another confused inference, a confused and mutilated copies of the past impressions mistaken as concepts, thanks to the distorted and illegitimate extensions of signs. Thanks to the transference mechanism, the scholastic system does not collapse, but sustains itself by multiplying the inferences indefinitely. In fact, the way the scholastics use the term probable to describe their arguments and conclusion point to this oddity. Probable here just means that so many other things in their system has to be corrected if this conclusion is not true. Is this just not a numbers game? Though, now the second point of the vulnerability is Suarez's own insistence that a mental abstraction between real essence and actual existence does not add any negation. But we have already discussed the way in which it does, how an abstraction transforms a thing in question into a non-being outside the order of nature. The separation does add a negation and makes the Suarezian real essence unreal. A separation between the essence and existence forces the affirmative universe to express itself negatively. Quote, I call a thing impossible whose nature implies that it would be contradictory for it to exist, necessary whose nature implies that it would be contradictory for it not to exist, and the possible whose existence by its very nature does not imply a contradiction. In this way, the scholastic God's actions are always threatened and linked with repugnance, even as they state otherwise. At once, it reduces something ontologically robust into a mere logical consistency. So Suarez's real essence is non-repugnant, a negative double negation, if you will, but the mere logical possibility is insufficient for it to be or to have intrinsic entitative act. If we agree that the Suarezian definition cannot admit distinction without introducing an unbridgeable gap between actus essendi and essentia, we're back to where we have started, the separated esses. And the gap between them can be closed only by the infinite power of the divine will or the mysterious providence of the divine intellect. The Scholastics' failed attempt to stitch back the two esses are sustained by the sacrilegious sanctuary of ignorance. The evil and inadequate reductio ad ignoratiam sustains the scholastic system, buttressed by the metaphorical transferences, and it can never reach the terminal and critical negation by design, as it begins with the affirmation of contradiction. Thank you.